My front door opened and slammed almost immediately. The loud bam could be heard and felt in every corner of my house, which is important because my house is quite large. "Mother! Are you here, Mom? Lance?" Something was wrong. Horribly wrong. I heard it in the way he called me. Any mother knows every note of her only child's voice. The man calls out to his mother in such a tone of desperation for one reason and one reason only. It was a cry of death. More precisely, the last plea to be delivered from her. For a man to take this to his mother means that he has given up all hope of surviving the ordeal. Rushing into the living room, I saw my son standing in the foyer of my home. And let me tell you, his look matched the desperation with which he was calling for me. His shoulders slumped, as if the clothes were too heavy for him. The eyes looked like they were sunk into his head. The face was flooded with tears. He looked as if death was hanging over him. "Lance, what's happened?" "Mom," he said, this time in such a quiet voice that he was barely audible. We walked up to each other and I hugged him tightly, just like when he was younger. Lance was now a little taller than me, so he had to lean down to return the hug. No matter how old a boy is, he will always need his mother. "Honey, what happened?" I repeated. His cheek pressed against the top of my head and his arms tightened around me. "She's gone, Mom. Lily left." These words hit me hard. I panicked. Lily, my sister-in-law, was much more to me than Lance's wife. She was my daughter in every sense that Lance was my son. I loved her as much as I could have if she had come from my very womb. Dear God, what happened to Lily? Pushing him slightly to give me space, I gently lifted my son's chin so that his eyes were level with mine. In a calm but tense voice, I said, "Lance, son, I need you to talk to me. I need to know what's going on. Is Lily okay?" At these words, his face changed. Almost instantly, that sad, despondent look turned into something else. His eyes froze. A cynical, angry grin appeared on his lips. He looked ominous. With chilling sarcasm in his voice, he answered my question. "Lily is doing great, Mom. You don't need to worry about her. She's just living her best life with Randall now." "Huh?" Seeing my confusion, he laughed loudly. It was a sad laugh. It was more like laughing to keep from crying. "Oh, she didn't tell you?" he asked rhetorically. "Yes, Lily, the daughter you never had, cheated on me." He gave me a minute to realize this. I have to admit, part of me was relieved. After the horrific scenarios I had running through my head involving Lily's mangled body in the car accident, it was nice to hear that she was safe and well. But then a second realization came. Awareness of the consequences of this new situation. How does this affect my son? How does this affect the whole family? Betrayal. In some ways, it was much, much worse. "What?" "Oh, yeah," he said, clapping his hands theatrically at the look of shock on my face. With dramatic humor in his voice, he continued. "Lily had a second relationship within 6 months." He laughed again as he walked away from me. He headed towards the kitchen, no doubt planning to pour himself something stronger. I followed him, my feet moving as if I were walking through mud. Entering the kitchen, I saw that my prediction was correct. He already took the whiskey, but didn't even bother to take the glass. He drank straight from the bottle. I lightly snatched the bottle from his hands without saying a word. I went to the cabinet and took out 2 glasses. I poured a little into both. Then I pushed one towards him. He raised his glass, swallowed the whiskey in one gulp, and motioned to me like a bartender asking for more. I poured him another, this time allowing myself to ask one of the questions that was burning in my head. "Who is Randall?" Having swallowed it like the first time, he answered caustically, "Randall is the guy my beloved wife had sex with behind my back." I guessed that he was her affair partner. I meant, who was he to her before she cheated? Her colleague? Her friend? Stranger from the internet? His face became sad again. He shrugged lifelessly. "Does it matter?" After thinking about it, I agreed. "No, I think not." This time I took a sip, but only because the silence between our words was uncomfortable. After a moment I asked, "Does she love him?" He turned away from me. as if he didn't want me to see the tear that rolled out of the corner of his eye and rolled down his cheek. He answered my question with a slight nod. Silence reigned again. I knew Lance wanted me to pour him more, but I didn't need him to get drunk. Situations like this require a clear head. Drinking alcohol temporarily dulls the pain, but this delay only makes the drinker more capable of causing more damage. I knew. I was in a similar situation many years ago. Tell me everything. Randall was the guy she worked with. Typical. They were involved in a joint project 2 years ago. He remembered this time frame because that's when she had to leave town for a week. She never mentioned Randall, which in itself was a red flag that Lance didn't even know existed. He just remembered that something was a little off about her when she came back. Nothing special, she was just a little more distant. There was no sex on that trip. The two of them were just hanging out. As friends. No harm done. As if sex is the only threat to marriage. Over the next year and a half, their connection grew. At that time, they were still colleagues. Nothing more than work friends. But that seed was sown and watered daily. Soon enough, their comfort and familiarity blurred the boundaries. Team-building lunch breaks turned into lunches for two. After work, after drinking with colleagues, the two of them went to a bar to relax. Lance never noticed this. He did not see how his wife was slipping away from him, getting closer to another man. Their marriage faced the predictable problem that most marriages do. They had less sex, less communication, less time for each other. But even during this, they hardly argued. They simply existed, floating around each other like a typical busy married couple. Lance said there were no signs. But I knew that was a lie. Men rarely notice the blinding neon light of their unhappy wife until it is too late. Still, I couldn't blame him. She should have let me know if she was unhappy with my son. What kind of person does this to the spouse he claims to love? The pain on Lance's face cooled my love for Lily. As he told his story, I saw the pieces of his heart scatter to pieces on the ground. The first time he noticed that something was wrong was when he walked in and found her crying. He thought something bad had happened at work, but he was wrong. Everything was exactly the opposite. Something wonderful happened at work, even though it was the worst thing that could have happened. She and this guy Randall kissed for the first time, passionately. One of those kisses that makes you question everything. It was perfect in all the wrong ways. It was 6 months ago when the affair began. At least that's what Lance thinks is a start. But I knew better. The romance really began 2 years ago during that work trip. That's when this ending became inevitable. Mutual attraction, which they pretend not to feel for each other. A secret nugget in the back of their minds when they secretly wondered what the other looked like naked. That kiss was just a small sprout growing out of the dirt. Sex, the only part that most men care about, lasted for 5 months. This was when the distance between husband and wife grew to the level of the Grand Canyon. That's when the controversy began. Cold bed, lonely nights, impassable dead end. And then today happened. He came home from work and saw her packing her things. We just moved away from each other. Everything between us has changed. We haven't had any contact for some time. You must have felt it. This was her explanation. 6 years of marriage broke up in one day. Of course, she said it as if she was doing him a favor. It wasn't fair to him to force him to live this lie. He needed to be free to find a woman who would love him with all her heart. He was such an amazing guy that it would truly be a disservice to keep him trapped in this loveless marriage. So, what are you going to do? I asked him when his words died down. He shrugged, and then his shoulders slumped. I don't know. His retelling of the events that led up to today had left him exhausted. He looked like he had been fighting all day. All I could do was hug him lovingly again. There is no greater feeling of helplessness than a mother looking at her suffering child. There was nothing I could do to free him from this. No amount of money or love on my part could help him. In this, he was truly alone. I hated Lily for this. No matter how much I loved her, I hated her. Lance didn't deserve this. Lily is dead to me. I whispered to him as we hugged, putting meaning into every word. I wanted my son to know that I was on his side. I wanted him to know that as much as I loved Lily, I would completely renounce any feelings I had for her if I had to choose between them. Lance slipped out of my arms and walked slowly across the kitchen. He ran both hands through his hair and took a deep breath. He walked up to the counter again, leaning his back against it. Just as I was thinking about how unscrupulous Lily was and what a disgusting woman she turned out to be, I heard Lance chuckle. It was bittersweet. Then words came out of his mouth that pierced me to the core. That must be how Dad felt. At first, the words didn't sink in. They sounded angry and hateful, so much so that I didn't immediately realize that they were directed at me. "What you said?" He turned to face me, and for the first time in decades, my son glared at me. "When you cheated on your dad and left him for Bill." He didn't have a chance to finish that sentence because my hand moved on its own. There was a loud bang that echoed spread out around the kitchen. How could he even force his mouth to say such nasty things? He was so young when it happened. He had no idea what happened between his father and me. Ever since my marriage to Thomas ended, all he knew was Bill. Thomas tried to fulfill his fatherly role in Lance's life, but I never asked him for anything when I left. I freed him completely and irrevocably. He got a house. He took the car. He didn't have to pay me any spousal or child support. The only thing I wanted from him was to live his own life. After all, he gave it to me. He disappeared and left Lance and I to live happily with Bill. No matter how much it killed him, he did me this favor. In return, I did the same for him. I thought this was the best way to do things, the best way to give us all a fresh start. Me, Lance, and Bill had the opportunity to be a family. Thomas had to move on without any financial ties to his previous life. Of course, it hurt at the time, but I felt like a complete break will heal much better than endless drama. Bill had money. He had a house. I had nothing to quarrel with Thomas about. In a sense, I was right. Lance had a good life. He went to private school. He went to one of the best colleges and graduated without student debt. He was able to start his career straight out of university and was now living a lucrative, wealthy life. Thomas was a hard worker, but there was no way he could give Lance any of that. This was the best way out of a confusing situation. At least that's what I thought. But now it seemed my son saw things differently. After that, the two of us stood there in silence, just looking at each other. I expected him to look apologetic, to feel remorse for his unjustified attack on me. But he didn't. He just stared at me, as if I had done him harm. Finally, I asked, "Why did you tell me this?" He sighed. "Because, Mom." "Because what?" With a groan, he tore himself away from the counter and began pacing the room again. The rhythmic sound of his footsteps echoed in the silence between our words. His tone then changed, going from angry to inquisitive as he asked, "What time will Bill be home this evening?" I almost screamed because he avoided the apology that was due to me, but I refrained. Suppressing my irritation at his sudden attack, I replied, "I don't know. You know Bill works late." He nodded thoughtfully in response to this information. Then, almost calculatingly, he asked, "Have you ever thought—" Admittedly, this has been a sore spot between Bill and I for months now. We argued about his late delays, his growing distance from me, and his lack of affection. I didn't know if Lance knew about it or not, which made me question why he even asked. I knew where he was going with this, and the very thought of where he was going with it disgusted me. "No, I'm sure," I said quickly. Such thoughts disgusted me. "Bill loves me. He is not capable of this." "You mean, loves like you loved Dad?" I gasped loudly at the icy accusation in his voice. Now I knew for sure that he was attacking me. His anger shifted from his wife to me. "Now listen to me," I said, closing the distance between us. I looked straight into his indignant eyes as I spoke sternly. "I'm not your wife. I'm your mother. Keep your anger where it belongs and don't take it out on me." I saw how he softened at my warning. This interaction gave me a wave of déjà vu. Not so much the topic of conversation, but the way he just looked at me when I scolded him. It was like that time he stayed up too late in high school and came home drunk and smelling of beer and marijuana. And again, my boy returned to me. The sad expression returned to his face, killing me again. Just as I was about to reach out and hug him, he asked, "Have you ever regretted what you did to Dad?" There was no anger in his voice, but that didn't lessen the urgency of his question. He wasn't really asking about Thomas or what I'd been doing all these years. He asked about himself. Will Lily ever regret what she did? Will she ever look back on this day and feel the burn? Or will she live happily ever after? Lance was so much like his father. Sometimes it was surprising how much he resembled him. And that was my curse, because looking at Lance right now was like going back in time. On that day, almost 2 decades ago, I stood in the kitchen with Thomas. It was much smaller than the kitchen in which I was now standing. Thomas would never have made as much money as Bill. Our house was smaller. Our lives were smaller. Bill was the personification of rags to riches. He built his company, where I worked as his secretary, from scratch. He was brave, he was smart, he was confident. He was a man who achieved what he wanted with unremitting energy. Thomas and I were on 2 different wavelengths. At that moment, we were so far from each other. We haven't been a couple for months. He should have known it was over between us. Our end was almost inevitable. But was it so? At that time, I was so sure. I truly believed it when I told him that he was a great guy who was going to make another woman the happiest woman in the world. It really was better for him to let me go and find her, someone who would love him the way he deserved to be loved. But that woman was not me. No more. Because now, I love Bill. Come to think of it, he looked exactly the same as my poor Lance looked now. It was as if his world had been completely destroyed. As if invading my secret thoughts and reading them, Lance intervened. He muttered to himself, but his words were clear as day. "People say that you will marry your mother, but I never thought..." With these words, he turned away from me. It was as if he couldn't look at me anymore, as if my appearance disgusted him. "Lance." I reached out to him. My heart broke when he waved me off. "I have to go," he muttered. I followed him, shouting his name, but he ignored me. He couldn't get away from me fast enough. A connection was made in his mind. His pain overlapped with the pain his father had experienced years before. The fact that he now walked in the same heavy boots that his father had once walked in filled him with compassion that far outweighed his love for me. "Lance, please. Where are you going?" At this time, he approached the door. He opened it and was about to go out when he heard me. For some reason, my question stopped him. There he stood, with one foot in my house and the other trying to escape from me. After a moment's thought, he looked at me and said, "I need to talk to the only person who knows what I'm going through." His father. He wanted to talk to Thomas. I sighed sadly. "Babe, no one even knows where he is." "I know," he said with a hint of the first real smile that appeared on him all evening. It was small, weak, and barely noticeable, but it was genuine. "I've known where he is for about a year now." "What?" "Yes." He shrugged. "I found him. Well, actually, he found me. But we've been talking since then." I don't know what scared me more, the fact that he talked to Thomas for a year, or the fact that he never told me about it. "About what?" I asked carefully, fighting the impulse to completely lose my composure. He didn't answer me. Not with words. But there was a look he gave me. The look that said everything. Then he disappeared. Just like when he entered, the loud slam of the front door shook the entire house. At that moment, I felt more alone than ever. Of course, I will always be his mother. Nothing could change that, not even Thomas. It would be a gross exaggeration to say that I had lost his love, no matter how much misplaced anger he was taking out on me right now. But I knew that he would never look at me the same way again. I was no longer infallible in my son's eyes. It's a sad day when our children realize that we are the same screwed up as the others. The next morning, I woke up in my bed. I was curled up in a fetal position, fully clothed from the night. Next to me was my mobile phone, only 15% charged. I spent several hours that night calling furiously. I called Lance, but no one answered. I called Bill, but no one answered. I even called my ex-husband, Thomas, but again I did not receive an answer. None of the men in my life wanted to talk to me. I felt the state of my devastated, tear-stained face even before I looked at the reflection in the mirror. I was a pathetic sight. I once had 2 men in love with me, vying for my affection, and now I couldn't even reach my husband. With a sad sigh, I splashed water on my face before going downstairs to make coffee. It didn't escape my notice that Bill didn't sleep in our bed. After the search of our ridiculously huge house, his presence was not felt in any room. Last night he didn't come home at all. Lately, this has been happening more and more often. An hour later, the front door opened. I quickly rushed into the living room and found my husband standing in the foyer. "Bill," I said, relief filling my voice. Just like that, my anger at him immediately dissipated. I needed him, and he was here. I needed to feel his arms around me. I needed to feel his love for me. Since the mirror of my soul had shown so much ugliness in the last 12 hours, I needed to see the eyes of love. I crashed into his body and wrapped myself around him, pressing my cheek to his chest. Just before I could breathe a sigh of relief, I noticed that his arms weren't wrapped around me. "Cute. Please. I need you to hold me." I expected to feel him, but nevertheless, his arms remained limp at his sides. Confused, I relaxed and looked up at him. He took a deep breath. It was almost as if he regretted being here in this room with me. It was as if circumstances had forced him into this unfortunate position. My heart has stopped. I knew that look. I knew that look all too well because it was the look I gave a man almost 2 decades ago. "Tina," he said, my name falling from his lips as if he was trying to soften the blow. "No! Please, no!" Tears streamed down my face. "Bill?" I said, practically begging him. "Honey, please, give me a hug. Tina, we need to talk." Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one.